Welcome. Today we're going to finish up part one of the eye, the features of the eye. And so I want to give you some basic terminology. So the terminology that you need to know for the features of the eye are the iris, is the colored portion of the eye. Then you have the pupil. The lacrimal duct is the tear duct. And remember that that is the anatomical center for the head itself. Next we have the white of the eye is called the sclera. And proportionally, you can fit two irises, two spheres, in the distance from the lacrimal duct to the outer canthus. So that's proportionally two iris. So the levator palpebrae is the upper lid, and that's what you get movement in the eye. It doesn't come from the lower lid. The lower lid does not move at all. And it actually, the lower lid is the contour line when your eye is closed. So this is the lower lid, sits on the infraorbital ridge. Next we have the orbicularis oris, and these are the muscles that I want you to know. So we've talked about the muscles. I've posted on the muscles. This is just a review. So you have surrounding the tissue, you have on the orbital cavity, you have the orbicularis oculi, the procerus, and the corrugator muscles. Now, just on the outer edge of the eye, we have the term called the outer canthus, the inner canthus, the plica band, and the caruncula. And I'll point those out here. So right here we have, this is, again, the orbital cavity. And remember that as you think about the eye, that it is an external, internal organ. The ball of the eye is about 1 inch in diameter, and it is 1 inch in diameter from the time of birth to death. So the eyeball itself does not grow or change in any way. It's about 90% fluid, so it's high intensity liquid. And the ball of the eye sits back at an angle. It does not sit flush or vertical. It sits back at an angle, and I'll talk about that in a minute. One of the things that's important is tracking. Now, when you were born, a pediatrician probably tested your eyes for tracking. And I've put inside this little pupil here. One of the things that a pediatrician will often check for is if those lines looking out from the center of the pupil are tracking correctly. So at a distance, you have a wider tracking. As you come up closer in your vision, you have less, that it's more straightforward. And then when you're looking at something really closely, the pupils tend to contract in. Well, one of the things that we are concerned about as an artist is we don't want to have one pupil looking one direction and one pupil looking another direction. So they're running parallel in space. And that's really important that we get that properly drawn. And one of the things that often will happen is that artists, as we conceive this, will put our eyes on different planes, and that's something we have to be constantly vigilant about, that we make sure that we draw the construction line, which gives us the rotation and angle for the skull, and draw that superciliar arch so that we see that overall alignment of that orbital cavity. If you get that and then get the infraorbital ridge, then you don't have a problem, because if you do that and you're drifting like this, the eyes will have a funhouse effect, which is never really that great a look. Okay, so let me talk to you about this particular eye right here. Make sure it's in the camera field. Okay, so this is basic. I've talked to you about this before, but I want to make sure that we review. So those of you that were drawing with me in 1260. So right here is the lacrimal duct or tear duct. And we have a lot of different tear ducts located in our sinus cavity, but this is the major one, and it's a tear sac that comes down underneath the ridge of the nose. And so it provides the fluid for the eye. If there's not enough fluid for the eye is continuously wet. And one of the things that we're concerned about as we draw the eye is that we convey to the viewer that it is a wet surface, a glossy surface. And that's really important. So the way that light is absorbed through this glossy surface is very different than on the skin. The skin is a semi-matte surface. It absorbs light differently than does a glossy surface. So first consider the direction of your light source. As I mentioned, this is the iris right here, and it's the colored portion of the eye. And the colored portion of the eye, when a baby is born, that's blue. So the surface of the ball of the eye is blue. And those that have brown eyes, for example, I have brown eyes, you have more pigment. So you can have a variation of combinations of the color of your eye, but the blue is the actual foundation for the base of the iris, and those that have a combination where they'd have hazel or they would have brown eyes, that is adding in more yellow pigment and creating that look. So the actual eye itself, again, here's the brow ridge or superciliar arch. It's what the brow is sitting on. And the brow is not a construct of individual hairs. It is a decision of value. And so as we put this in, it's darkest here. It traverses this direction, and the hair growth, like it's wrapping around this cylinder, the hair growth comes up like this around that cylinder. So it comes up and out. But overall, we don't show individual hairs except for on the edges. So you might indicate a few hairs here. That gives life to it. It's darkest down here. It's a two-part plane change, and lighter as it gets up here because it's wrapping around that plane of the superciliar arch. And on a female, it arches more. It hits this apogee right here, and that apogee or high point is the lightest part of the value of this. Now where that turns is right on the skull itself. So here's our skull again. Here's the superciliar arch. Here's the sinus eminence. And that brow is wrapping around that. And the point that it stops is right here. Okay, so that's where the plane change is. And look for it when you're looking on your model. So from that point, the actual fibers of the hair, not fibers, but the hair, turns direction, and it turns down. And not only does it turn down, it begins to lighten. So the darkest value is here toward the inside where the glabella is, and then it wraps up till it hits a high point or apogee, and then light falls, and it's a very small segment. It does thick to thin, so it comes up and across. And that's all the construction that you need in the very beginning. Is it just an indication where that brow will be, and then we'll apply value. Okay, so this back crease of the eye itself, this is where we'll see a darker value. For us doing any kind of value work, this is an area that we would kind of judiciously apply a dark accent. That's where we want to put the emphasis. So in using and applying value, the area that we want the most amount of focus is we want it in the eye. So the most amount of detail is going to be in this area. So from this back crease, we have this form right here is often referred to as the sausage or the French fry. I don't know why they use food terminology, but that's common. And so it's important to think about the cross contour lines. This wraps from this direction up to this point right here. And it's constantly turning. So as we round that, we've got to think of this cylinder-like form and round that up toward highlight. Oftentimes makeup artists will put a highlight right here on the makeup, and that gives interest. Now, one thing about the pupil of the eye is an aperture. So it opens and closes, just like the aperture of a camera, and it allows light in. So those of you that want to show that your model is very interested in you, increase the size or manipulate the size of the opening of the pupil, because when someone is interested in what you're talking about, their eyes dilate. So you can see if you're communicating with someone and within 6 feet, right? And if their eyes begin to dilate, that means they have an emotional response to what you're talking about and are interested. So next we have this levator palpebrae, which is the upper lid. The important thing to remember for value is it is a 3-part plane change. So the center portion of this plane is right here. This is a light-facing plane, and then it begins to turn down and under. Now, not only does that upper lid, it is thicker than the lower lid because it has a larger circumference to turn. And so this has a thickness to it that oftentimes artists indicate as the lash rather than indicating individual hairs. But you can, on the edges, show hairs. One of my favorite artists is Jacob Collins out of New York City. And he will often show these upper lashes by indicating that they come up and over the zygomatic and just indicate it by way of a cast shadow. So as I mentioned, the white of the eye is the sclera. This is the cast shadow that's created by the upper levator. And we've got to think, as far as rounding this, and I'll demonstrate in just a minute, of longitude and latitude. So the latitude, longitude, and as we turn this toward the light, an actual model form, we have to think of the sphere-like form that it is. So then we have the lower lid. It is a light-facing plane. And what's distinct about this is right here, you'll often see just a little bit of grayness. Those of you that will be going on to doing painting, for example, you'll see a little bit of gray right in this area. And then you'll see on the edge of this inner canthus, you'll see a source of light right here. It's just always depending on the lighting, but it's usually pretty light right in this area. So this is inner canthus, this is outer canthus. Right here, in fact, I don't have it shown that well. Let me draw it out for you right here. So on this corner of this eye right here, this is what's called the plica band. And we have other areas that have a band. And that little plica band is very viscous and red. And so in a photograph, for example, that would go very dark, and it's not. Then this little thing called the caruncula has a little 2-part segment right here. And it's part of the tear duct or lacrimal duct, but it's called the caruncula. And that's this segment right here. So we've got around this direction, and then we're rounding this direction. So longitude and latitude. Now, one of the things, since I'm over here, that I wanted to talk about is that there is not differences, significant differences between different races. The Asiatic eye has no different angle in the orbital cavity. It has an extra fold called an epicanthic fold, and that's the Asiatic fold. Now, as someone ages, sometimes you'll see the French fry start to do what's called ptosis, and that means that eye starts to come down and just overlap the upper lid. Okay? So that's ptosis. All right, now, as far as this lower lid, right here, you'll see a little bit of value along this edge, defining that edge. As you studied Great Master drawings, you'll notice that they don't include a lot of information in this area. They don't try to complete that for the viewer. They'll show a little bit of value here as indicated for the shadow of the eye. Now, back up to the iris. So this is a very important concept. So you've got to consider your light source, and right here I've got the direction of the light source. So this is sitting back. It's an external internal organ, and it's sitting back in this cavity that's protecting it. So it already has value to it. And as you see from the profile, this has an overhang right here on the superciliar arch. So it protects or cushions. Now, underneath this cavity, on the ball of the eye, there is a pad of fat. So if someone were to take a hit or have something project into this area, this is a structure that would protect it. And so it sits on a pad of fat, and you'll see that that pad of fat is a protection as well, because it will absorb shock. If it didn't, the eye would just explode. And it, again, it's made most of fluid. So as we look at this, the important part of it for us as artists is that, again, this is a glossy surface. We have the sclera, the white of the eye, which is never the white of the eye. When I was first married, my father-in-law, he was a brilliant engineer. He developed the gyroscope on the stealth bomber. And I mean, he did that at age 17, so he was a genius. And he loved to dabble in art. One time I saw a portrait that he had done, and as I started studying more drawings, sometimes you'll see this, where artists will leave that the white of the eye. It is never the white of the eye. It's about a value of 7 or lower. And if you see it, the complete white of the eye, it's very stark, and it looks like Night of the Living Dead to have the sclera all white. It's not that way. And I saw a portrait done by my father-in-law, who was really talented, but he didn't understand that concept. In art, we're judged by what we don't know. And someone may not be able to tell you how to change it, but they'll quickly tell you if it's wrong. So this is an important concept. So you've got the cast shadow. It is darkest as it reaches its high point or apogee, and then it falls down and under. And then you get the white, the colored portion of the eye. This is an ellipse in space. So in profile, you'd see less of that. And if you don't see less of it, then what you get is an Asiatic eye. So here is the eye in profile. And it's really important to see this shape. If this shape goes back too far, like this, this is giving the full eye width, which is about 1 inch. And that is not correct. So the eye in profile is not deep. And to the degree that you see that, you'll have to actually cite that on your model. But in profile, the eyeball itself sits back at a 30-degree angle. You get the height of this and the low portion of this. but it's a very small triangle right here that you're looking at. And that becomes, in space, that becomes a pupil. The pupil and the iris are ellipses. So they are a circle on a circle. So the iris is a circle or a sphere. And then you get the pupil is centered inside that sphere, and it's also a sphere. And so as that rotates in space, it becomes an ellipse. So then the next construct that we need to talk about is how light strikes this iris. Now, the iris itself has a high point, or oftentimes a highlight. Now, if you don't see that on the model, don't put it on, because it changes your perspective, or your atmospheric perspective. So we have two types of perspective that we're dealing with in figure drawing. We have atmospheric perspective, and most commonly we have linear. So linear is what you've been using up until this point. Atmosphere means that as something recedes to the horizon line, it gets cooler in temperature, it gets bluer, and it gets less focus. Okay? So we're using those principles as well. So we've got a highlight right here. And because it's a glossy surface, light does an interesting thing. Light does not, like on a semi-porous surface, light hits this surface and then bounces back. On a surface such as a glossy surface, on the ball of the eye, and this is the only instance on the human figure where this happens, is you have highlight, but then corresponding opposite that, on the oblique, you have a light source that's a secondary light source, and that's called refracted light. Okay, I hope you can hear that well in my mask. Refraction. Okay, so this is refracted light right here. Where it becomes lighter in value, it is not as light as the highlight itself. So, but it is lighter right in here. And oftentimes, especially on a brown eye or a blue eye, you'll see it become more yellow in that area because it starts to show some of the extra pigment. Okay, so I think I've covered all the terminology. Important for us for drawing is how we see the angle of the eye or the line of action. We want to make sure that we sight it. It is always this trajectory, this angle. We first start sighting that as a parallel decision across the form. We think globally. And secondly, we understand that the lacrimal duct is slightly lower than the outer canthus because it's a drain. And so as a drain, it has to have that ability to be slightly down so that the fluid will not accumulate in the eye. Okay, so any questions about what I've just talked about? No? Okay, now I'm going to begin to do a demonstration for you. So I'm going to shut off the camera and